I was alone on that dusty Texas road. That is how it felt anyway. In reality, I was standing in the center of the most expensive square footage in Santa Fe, surrounded by walls painted a shade of white that cost more than my father's first house. The air conditioning was humming at a frequency that drilled into the base of my skull, a constant reminder of the artificial atmosphere I had meticulously curated. But in my spirit, I was stranded. I was miles away from water, miles away from home, and miles away from the person I used to be. I was standing on a desolate, emotional highway, watching the tumbleweeds of my own anxiety roll by, waiting for a rescue that I was too proud to ask for. The gallery was named Lumina. I had chosen the name because it sounded ethereal, expensive, and vaguely European. It was my temple, my fortress, and my prison. The floor was polished concrete, sealed to a high gloss that reflected the distorted silhouettes of the city's elite. They were beginning to filter in for the Visions of the Modern West auction, a collection of people who wore their net worth on their wrists and their insecurities in the tightness of their smiles. The sound of the room was a cacophony of crystal flutes clinking against diamond rings, the sharp staccato of designer heels striking the hard floor, and the low, droning buzz of conversations that meant absolutely nothing. I checked my watch for the 10th time in 3 minutes. My heart was hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs, a trapped bird desperate to escape the cage of my designer blazer. The numbers on the spreadsheet I held in my trembling hand were not just figures, they were a countdown. If tonight didn't go perfectly, if the auction didn't break records, Lumina would go dark. The bank had been calling. The investors were getting restless. I was drowning in debt, and drowning in the pressure to maintain the illusion that I was the queen of this sterile kingdom. "Eleanor, darling," a voice trilled from my left. I snapped my head around, plastering on the mask, the smile that didn't reach my eyes, the tilt of the head that suggested interest rather than exhaustion. It was Mrs. Vanderveer, a woman who bought art to match her sofas. The lighting on the abstract piece, is it slightly aggressive? I feel it might wash out the texture. "I'll adjust it immediately, Beatrice," I lied, my voice smooth, practiced, and utterly hollow. "We want the anguish of the artist to really pop, don't we?" She nodded, satisfied by my nonsense, and drifted away toward the champagne tower. I let out a breath I didn't know I was holding and turned back to the entrance. I needed the critics to arrive. I needed Julian, the most vicious and influential voice in the Southwest art scene, to validate my existence. I was scanning the glass doors, praying for a savior in an Italian suit. Instead, the automatic doors slid open, and the heat of the desert tried to force its way into my refrigerated sanctuary. And then he walked in. At first, I didn't look at his face. My eyes, trained to assess value from the ground up, locked instantly onto the boots. They were not fashion statements. They were not the pristine, exotic leathers sold in the boutiques down the street for thousands of dollars. These were working boots. The leather was cracked in the creases, telling a story of thousands of miles walked. And there, clinging to the stitching and the heels, was a fine layer of red dust. Real dust. The kind of dirt you can't buy. The kind that comes from standing in a corral at dawn or walking a fence line when the sun is beating down hard enough to melt resolve. My gaze traveled up the denim jeans. Starched, yes, but clearly worn for utility, not irony. A simple belt with a silver buckle that wasn't flashy, just solid. A button-down shirt, crisp and clean, tucked in with a discipline that seemed out of place in a room full of untucked linen and deconstructed fashion. Finally, I saw the face. He was standing under the harsh halogen track lights, but he seemed to bring his own shadow with him, cast by the brim of a cowboy hat that had seen rain, snow, and sweat. He stood completely still. In a room where everyone was moving, gesturing wildly, looking over shoulders for someone more important to talk to, checking phones, spinning in circles of social anxiety, this man was an anchor. He was a statue of calm in a sea of chaos. He didn't look lost, though he clearly didn't belong. He looked like he was exactly where he intended to be. Even if the universe had made a mistake in the scenery, it was George Strait. But in that split second, my brain didn't register country music legend. My brain, poisoned by stress and the desperate need for this night to be flawless, registered disruption. I saw a cowboy, I saw a rancher who had perhaps taken a wrong turn looking for a feed store or a saloon. I saw a visual anomaly that was going to ruin the aesthetic of my high-end event. Julian was due any minute. If he walked in and saw a dusty cowboy standing in front of the minimalist installations, he would laugh. He would make a joke about how rustic Lumina had become. I couldn't afford jokes. I needed awe. Panic, cold and sharp, spiked in my chest. I shoved the spreadsheet into my pocket and began to march across the gallery floor. The click-clack of my heels was aggressive, a warning shot. I navigated through the crowd of socialites, excusing myself with tight smiles, my eyes fixed on the man standing by the entrance. He hadn't moved. He was looking at a painting, a massive canvas painted entirely in shades of white and eggshell titled The Void of Consumerism. It was priced at $40,000. He was studying it with the same intensity one might use to study a storm front rolling in over the plains. I stopped 3 feet from him. The smell hit me then. It wasn't the overpowering cologne of the men around me smelling of musk and money. It was subtle. It smelled like rain on hot asphalt. It smelled like sagebrush and old leather. It was the smell of the world I had run away from to build this glass cage. It irritated me instantly. "Excuse me, sir," I said, my voice pitched to that professional level of politeness that is actually a dismissal. He turned his head slowly. His eyes were blue, but not the icy blue of the Santa Fe sky in winter. They were warm, crinkled at the corners by years of squinting against the sun. There was a kindness in them that disarmed me for a fraction of a second before my defenses slammed back into place. "Evening, ma'am," he said. His voice was soft, a low rumble that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. It didn't demand attention, yet it commanded it. "I'm afraid this is a private event," I said, gesturing vaguely to the room. "The gallery is closed to the general public for the auction. The loading dock and deliveries are around the back if you're looking for someone." I assumed he was a driver or a lost contractor, anything but a guest. He didn't get angry. He didn't puff up his chest or flash a "do you know who I am" glare. He just smiled, a slight tilt of the lips that suggested he knew a joke I hadn't figured out yet. He reached up and touched the brim of his hat. "Not delivering anything," he said gently. "Just admiring the view. Saw the lights from the street. The air in here. It's different from the outside, isn't it?" "It's climate-controlled," I snapped, my patience fraying. "To protect the art." "So of course," he nodded, looking back at the white canvas. "Protecting it, that's important." He wasn't leaving. My hands curled into fists at my sides. I was about to call security, a beefy man named Carl who was currently eating a canapé by the fire exit, when the glass doors opened again. This time the energy in the room shifted for a different reason. Julian had arrived. Julian was a man who wore scarves in the summer and spoke in paragraphs that required a dictionary to decipher. He was the gatekeeper of taste in this town. If Julian wrote a good review, I could pay off the bank. If he sneered, I was finished. He swept in, surrounded by his entourage of sycophants, his eyes scanning the room like a predator looking for the weakest gazelle, and his eyes landed straight on us. Specifically, on the cowboy hat standing next to me. I wanted the floor to open up and swallow me whole. I tried to step in front of George, to shield the visual pollution from the critic's gaze, but it was too late. Julian's face lit up with a cruel delight. He changed course, steering his group directly toward us. "Elena, darling," Julian's voice was like shattering glass, "I see you've decided to embrace an eclectic theme for the evening." He stopped in front of us, looking George up and down with open amusement. The people around him tittered, covering their mouths with manicured hands. "Julian?" I managed to choke out. "I was just explaining to this gentleman that—" No, don't send him away," Julian interrupted, waving a hand dismissively. He stepped closer to George, invading his personal space. George didn't flinch. He didn't step back. He just looked at Julian with that same steady, unbothered gaze. "Tell me, my good man," Julian said, his tone dripping with condescension. He gestured to a sculpture nearby, a tangled mess of rusted barbed wire wrapped around a neon light, titled The Agony of Boundaries. "What is your interpretation of the juxtaposition of industrial decay and artificial luminescence presented here?" The room went quiet. The chatter died down. Everyone loves a spectacle, and Julian was preparing to roast a local for sport. I felt a sick knot in my stomach, not because I cared about the stranger, I barely knew him, but because the awkwardness was palpable. I expected the cowboy to stutter, to look at his boots, to mumble something about not knowing much about art. I expected him to be humiliated, and by extension, for my gallery to look like a circus. George looked at the sculpture. He took his time. He looked at the rusted wire. He looked at the neon light buzzing faintly. Then he looked back at Julian. "Well," George said, his voice carrying easily through the silent room without him having to raise it. "Looks to me like someone took a good piece of fence that could have held a herd and tangled it up so bad it can't hold anything at all, and then they put a light on it so you can see the mistake in the dark." A few people gasped. I froze. Julian blinked. The insult, if it was an insult, was so simple, so practical, that it completely bypassed his intellectual defenses. He laughed, a short, sharp bark of a sound. "Charming," Julian declared, turning to his group. "Absolutely rustic. The primitive perspective is so refreshing, isn't it? It strips away the nuance and leaves us with, well, wire." He turned back to George, his smile now predatory. He wasn't done, he wanted blood. He wanted to prove that intellect was superior to simplicity. "Stick around, cowboy," Julian said. "We're about to auction off the centerpiece, a photograph. I'd love to hear your primitive perspective on that. It might be amusing for the investors." Julian walked away, his entourage trailing behind him like a tail. I was left standing there with George, my face burning with vicarious shame. I turned to him, expecting him to be angry. I expected him to storm out. "Sir, I am so sorry," I whispered, the apology tasting like ash in my mouth. "Julian is difficult. You don't have to stay. Really, you should probably go. It's not going to get any better." George looked at me. For the first time, I saw something other than calm in his eyes. I saw pity, not the condescending kind, but the kind of pity you feel for an animal that has caught its leg in a trap and is chewing it off to escape. "Ma'am," he said softly, "I've dealt with rattlesnakes before. They make a lot of noise before they strike, but if you don't move, they usually just slither on by. I think I'll stay. I'm curious about this picture he's so proud of." "Why?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Why would you stay where you're being mocked?" He adjusted his hat, looking out over the sea of people who were pretending to be happy. "Because," he said, "sometimes the only way to clear the air is to let the storm break. And I have a feeling there's a storm coming." I didn't understand him then. I thought he was just stubborn. I didn't know that I was standing next to a man who had built a career on understanding the human heart, a man who could say more in a 3-minute song than Julian could say in a 3-hour lecture. I didn't know that my life was about to pivot on the axis of his quiet dignity. The lights in the gallery dimmed. A spotlight hit the podium at the far end of the room. The auctioneer, a man with a voice like oiled gravel, stepped up to the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen," the auctioneer boomed, "welcome to the highlight of our evening. Please gather round." I moved automatically toward the front, my job demanding that I be there to record the bids. To my surprise, George followed me. He didn't push through the crowd. The crowd seemed to part for him. Maybe it was the boots. Maybe it was the way he walked, with a slow rolling gait that suggested he had nowhere to be, and all the time in the world to get there. We stood near the back of the circle of chairs. Julian was in the front row, legs crossed, holding a glass of wine, looking like a king on his throne. 2 assistants, wearing white gloves, brought out the easel. It was covered by a black velvet cloth. This was it. The piece that was supposed to save me. It was a rare vintage photograph from 1970, discovered in an attic in Amarillo, attributed to a reclusive photographer who had vanished shortly after taking it. It was titled, "The Silence of the Plains." "This piece," Julian announced, standing up and turning to face the crowd, effectively hijacking the auctioneer's moment, "is a masterpiece of desolation. It captures the death of the American dream. It shows the ultimate futility of man's struggle against nature. It is bleak, it is hopeless, and that is why it is beautiful." He gestured to the assistants. They pulled the cloth away. The photograph was black and white. grainy with age but sharp in focus. It showed a wooden fence line stretching into infinity. In the foreground, there was a horse, its head lowered. And standing next to the horse, partially obscured by shadow, was the silhouette of a young man holding the reins. The sky in the photo was vast, overwhelming. The crowd murmured appreciatively. "So lonely," someone whispered. "Tragic," another said. "Bidding will start at $50,000, the auctioneer cried out. "55 yen," shouted a man in the second row. "60, Julian countered, raising his paddle. "I must have this testament to sorrow." I watched the numbers climb. 65, 70, $75,000. My heart should have been soaring. This was enough to pay the rent for 6 months. This was enough to silence the bank. I should have been ecstatic, but I felt cold. I looked at the photo, really looked at it, trying to see the death of the dream that Julian spoke of. It just looked quiet. Then I felt a shift beside me. George had taken a step forward. He wasn't looking at the auctioneer. He was looking at the photo with an expression I couldn't decipher. It looked like recognition. It looked like grief. It looked like love. 80,000, Julian yelled, scanning the room, daring anyone to challenge him. Going once, going twice. It's not dying. The voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the fever of the bidding like a knife through a curtain. It was George. The auctioneer paused, his gavel hovering in the air. The room turned. Julian spun around in his chair, his eyes narrowing. "Excuse me," Julian sneered. "The cowboy has an opinion. Please, share it with the class. What do you think you see?" George took another step. He walked past me, past the rows of chairs, until he was standing 10 feet from the easel. He took off his hat and held it against his chest. The stage lights caught the silver in his hair. "I said it's not dying," George repeated, his voice steady. "And that horse isn't giving up, he's resting." "And how would you know?" Julian laughed, standing up to confront him. "This is art, my friend. It's about metaphor. It's about the crushing weight of the void. That horse represents the exhaustion of the soul." "No, sir," George said. He looked at the photo and then he looked at the crowd. That horse's name was Rusty, and he wasn't exhausted from the void. He was tired because we'd been up since 3 in the morning pulling a calf out of a mud bog during a flash flood. The silence that followed was absolute. It was heavier than the silence in the photograph. "And it's not sunset," George continued, pointing a finger at the horizon line in the black and white image. "See that light? That's the east. That's sunrise. That's not the end of the dream. That's the beginning of a day's work. It's not about giving up. It's about catching your breath before you start again." Julian's face turned a shade of red that clashed with his scarf. "Preposterous," he sputtered. "You're making this up. You're just a sentimental rancher projecting your simple life onto a complex work of art. You have no proof. You're just trying to sound important." I watched George. I waited for him to back down. I waited for him to realize he couldn't win an argument about art history with a man who had a PhD in it. But George didn't argue. He just looked at the photo, a soft smile touching his lips. "I don't need to project anything, sir," George said. "I know that fence. I dug the post holes for it when I was 17. My daddy taught me how to string that wire so it would sing in the wind." He turned to look directly at me. For a moment it felt like we were the only 2 people in the room. "And the boy holding the reins?" George asked, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow reached the back of the room. He wasn't sad. He was just thinking about a girl he was going to see at the dance later that night. He was full of hope. "I know." He paused, and the weight of his next words shattered the glass ceiling of the gallery. "Because that boy is me." The silence in the room wasn't just quiet. It was a vacuum. It sucked the air out of the lungs of every person standing there. For a moment, the only sound was the hum of the air conditioner, which suddenly seemed incredibly loud, like a mechanical intruder in a sacred space. "Because that boy is me." The words hung in the air, simple and devastating. They didn't just contradict Julian's elaborate theory, they erased it. They took the metaphor of the void and replaced it with the reality of sweat, mud, and a young man's hope. I looked at the photograph again, really looked at it. The silhouette I had barely glanced at before suddenly had weight. The slump of the shoulders wasn't defeat, as Julian had insisted. It was the relaxed posture of a man taking a break. The way the head was turned. Yes. I looked from the photo to the man standing in front of it. The line of the jaw, the set of the shoulders. It was undeniable. The ghost in the picture had just walked into the room and claimed his body. Julian was the first to move. He didn't accept defeat gracefully. Men like him never do. His ego was a fortress, and George had just lobbed a cannonball through the front gate. Impossible, Julian scoffed, though his voice lacked its usual oily confidence. He stepped closer to the easel, practically shoving his face into the print, as if looking for a flaw in the molecular structure of the paper. This is a convenient fabrication, a charming story to entertain the masses. Do you expect us to believe that you, a random passerby, are the subject of a piece of high art documented by the elusive photographer Elias Thorne? George didn't move. He didn't defend himself, he just stood there, his hat still held respectfully against his chest, watching Julian unravel. I didn't know his name was Elias, George said quietly. He just told us to call him Red because of that sunburn he got his first day out. He stayed in our bunkhouse for 3 days. My mama fed him biscuits and gravy. He didn't have much money, said he was trying to capture the spirit of the land before he went back east. He took that picture the morning he left. Lies, Julian shouted, turning to face the crowd, his face flushed. This man is a fraud. He's trying to inflate the value of the work by attaching a false narrative to it. Or worse, he's trying to devalue it by reducing it to agriculture. The crowd was shifting. The socialites, who usually followed Julian's lead like sheep, were looking uncertain. They looked at George, standing tall and calm in his dusty boots, and then at Julian, who was practically vibrating with rage in his Italian loafers. There was an authenticity to George that was hard to ignore. It was the difference between a plastic flower and a wild rose. One was perfect and dead, the other was flawed and alive. I felt a sudden, fierce protectiveness surge in my chest. It surprised me. I had spent years trying to please men like Julian, trying to gain entry into their club. But watching him try to bully this man who had done nothing but speak the truth, made me sick. Julian, I said, stepping forward. My voice was shaking, but I forced it to be loud. Julian, stop. Look at him. Look at the photo. You can see it. Be quiet, Elena, Julian snapped, not even looking at me. You're desperate for a sale, so you'll believe any fairy tale this cowboy spins. This is embarrassing. I am going to expose this charade right now. He pulled out his phone, his fingers flying across the screen. I have the contact for the estate of Elias Thorne. The representative is actually in Santa Fe this week. I was going to meet him tomorrow, but I will get him on a video call right now. We will settle this. The room waited. The tension was thick, suffocating. George just watched, a faint sadness in his eyes. He wasn't sad for himself. He was sad for Julian. He was watching a man fight a war against reality, and he knew who was going to win. While Julian frantically dialed, I moved closer to George. I'm so sorry, I whispered again. I didn't know. If I had known... George turned to me. Known what, ma'am? That I was the boy in the picture? Or that the truth would upset your friend so much? He's not my friend, I said, the realization hitting me hard. He's a customer, and I think I've been selling the wrong things. George smiled then, a genuine, warm smile that made me want to cry. Well, that's the first step to selling the right things. Aha! Julian cried out triumphantly. He held his phone up high, the screen displaying a loading video call. I have him, Mr. Sterling, the curator of the Thorne Archive. Quiet, everyone. The room fell silent again. On the small screen of the phone, which Julian projected onto the wall using the gallery's AV system, an elderly face appeared. Mr. Sterling was a man with thick glasses and a bow tie, sitting in a book-lined study. Julian, the voice crackled through the speakers. Is that you? It's rather late. Mr. Sterling, Julian said, his voice dripping with vindication. I apologize for the intrusion, but we have a situation at the auction. A man here claims to be the subject of The Silence of the Plains. He claims to be the boy holding the horse. He's concocting a ridiculous story about biscuits and a nickname Red. I need you to debunk him so we can proceed. On the screen, Mr. Sterling's expression changed. He leaned closer to his camera. He mentioned the biscuits. And the name read, "Yes, yes, some nonsense about feeding the photographer." Julian waved his hand dismissively. "Just tell these people it's impossible." Mr. Sterling was silent for a long moment. Then his voice came through, softer, filled with a sudden emotion. "Julian, turn the camera around. I want to see this man." Julian hesitated, a flicker of doubt crossing his face for the first time, but he had gone too far to back down. He turned the phone toward George. George stood there looking into the camera lens. He took off his hat again. "Hello," George said simply. On the screen, the elderly curator gasped. He took off his glasses and wiped his eyes. "My God," Sterling whispered. "Elias wrote about you in his journals. He talked about the ranch in Texas. He talked about the family that took him in when he had nothing. He said the young man, the son, he said he had a voice that could calm the wildest horse." Sterling paused, his voice trembling. "He said your name was George." Julian froze. The phone almost slipped from his hand. "George," Sterling continued, addressing the man in my gallery. "Elias always regretted leaving so soon. He said that photo was the only honest thing he ever took. He called it the silence of the plains because he said you and your father didn't need words to understand each other. It wasn't about despair, Julian. It was about connection." The revelation hit the room like a physical wave. The anguish and existential dread that Julian had been selling were gone. In their place was something far more powerful: humanity. Julian lowered the phone slowly. He looked at the screen, then at George, then at the floor. He looked small, deflated. The air of superiority that he wore like armor had evaporated, leaving just a petty man in a scarf who had been wrong about everything. It appears I was mistaken," Julian mumbled, his voice barely audible, but the room wasn't listening to him anymore. 100,000! The shout came from the back of the room. It was Mrs. Vanderveer. She was looking at George with wide, shining eyes. She wasn't looking at him like a curiosity anymore. She was looking at him like he was a living legend. 120,000! Another voice shouted. It was a tech billionaire who had been silent all night. "I want the story. I want the truth." The bidding war that followed was unlike anything I had ever seen. It wasn't driven by greed or the desire to own a status symbol. It was driven by a desperate hunger for authenticity. These people, trapped in their high-rise apartments and their digital lives, were suddenly starving for the dirt, the sweat, and the realness that George represented. They weren't buying a photo of a dying dream. They were buying a piece of the sunrise. They were buying the hope that George had spoken of. $200,000, $250. I stood there stunned, watching the numbers climb into the stratosphere. My debt was gone, my gallery was saved. But as I watched the frenzy, I felt a strange hollowness. I looked at George. He wasn't watching the auction. He wasn't reveling in the fact that his face was suddenly worth $250,000. He was looking at the door. He looked like a man who had been trapped in an elevator for too long. He caught my eye and gave a small nod. He started to walk away, moving toward the exit. "Wait," I called out, abandoning the podium. I ran after him, my heels slipping on the polished concrete. I caught up to him, just as the automatic doors slid open, letting in the warm night air. "You're leaving?" I asked, breathless. "George, they're bidding on you. You're the star. You just made this the most successful night in the history of Lumina." He stopped and turned to me. The noise of the auction was a dull roar behind us. Out here under the overhang, it was quieter. "I didn't do it for the auction, Elena," he said, "and I'm not a star. I'm just a man who remembers where he came from." "But Julian," I stammered, "you destroyed him. You proved him wrong in front of everyone. Don't you want to see him apologize?" George chuckled, a low, earthy sound. "There's no victory in watching a man crumble, darling. He's got to live with himself. That's punishment enough. Besides, he wasn't wrong because he's stupid. He was wrong because he's forgotten how to look at things with his heart instead of his head." He looked back into the gallery, where the bidding had reached $300,000. "They're buying a picture of a memory," he said softly. "But they're missing the point. You can't buy the sunrise. You have to wake up early and be there to see it. You have to be willing to stand in the cold and wait." I felt tears prickling my eyes. I realized then how tired I was, not just physically but spiritually. I was tired of the white walls. I was tired of the fake smiles. I was tired of Julian and everything he represented. "I don't know who I am anymore," I confessed, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. "I built this place to be important, to be valuable. But tonight I feel like everything in there is just noise." George looked at me with that penetrating, kindly gaze. He didn't offer a platitude. He didn't tell me it would be okay. "Value isn't a price tag, Elena," he said. "And it isn't what people like Julian say it is. Value is what you have left when you strip all the paint away. It's what stands up when the wind blows." He pointed to his boots. "These boots have walked through mud, manure, and snow. They ain't pretty, but they keep my feet dry and they get me home. That's value." He looked at me, and his expression turned serious. "You're a smart woman. You built a castle here, but castles are cold. Maybe it's time you opened a few windows, or maybe—" He paused, looking out at the dark street. "Maybe it's time you stepped outside of it." "But where would I go?" I asked, feeling like a child lost in a supermarket. "Well," he said, tipping his hat, "Texas is a big place, and the road goes on forever. But you don't have to go that far. You just have to start looking for the things that don't have a price." He turned to leave. "Wait," I said again. "Who are you, really? I mean, I know your name is George, but—" He paused, one foot on the sidewalk. He looked back over his shoulder, a twinkle in his eye. "Just a neighbor," he said. "Just someone who likes a good picture of a horse." And then he walked away. He walked out of the pool of artificial light from the gallery and into the shadows of the street. He didn't get into a limousine. He walked toward an old pickup truck parked down the block, a truck that I hadn't noticed before because it was too dirty to register on my radar. I watched him get in. I heard the engine turn over, a rough coughing sound that settled into a steady, reliable idle. I watched the taillights fade as he drove away, leaving me standing alone on the sidewalk. Inside, the gavel banged. "Sold! For $400,000! The room erupted in applause. People were cheering. Champagne corks were popping. It was the moment I had dreamed of for 5 years. It was the pinnacle of my career. But out there on the street, in the silence that George Strait had left behind, I felt something else entirely. I felt the first crack in the glass. I felt the first breath of real air entering my lungs. I turned around and looked at my gallery. Through the glass, I saw Julian slumped in a chair, defeated. I saw the investors high-fiving. I saw the white walls, the concrete floor, the perfect lighting. And for the first time, I didn't see a temple. I saw a cage. And I knew with a terrifying certainty that I couldn't go back in there and be the same person. The cowboy had come, he had seen, and without firing a single shot, he had conquered my world. I took a deep breath of the night air. It smelled of exhaust and city dust, but underneath that, if I concentrated, I could almost imagine the smell of sagebrush. I walked back inside, not to celebrate, but to begin the long, painful work of tearing it all down. Here is part 3 of the script. I walked back into the gallery, but it felt like I was walking onto a movie set after the director had yelled cut. The actors were still saying their lines, the extras were still drinking the prop champagne, but the illusion was gone. The magic, if there ever was any, had walked out the door with a man in a dusty hat. "Elena! Elena, darling!" Mrs. Vanderveer grabbed my arm, her diamond bracelets digging into my skin. Her face was flushed with the intoxication of the moment. Did you see the drama? It was exquisite. The way he stood there, so raw. It was better than performance art. You are a genius for hiring him. Absolutely a genius." I looked at her. I looked at the woman who had been my best client for 3 years, the woman whose approval I had craved like a drug. "I didn't hire him, Beatrice," I said, my voice flat. "Oh, stop being so modest," she laughed, winking. It was perfect theatre, the noble savage crashing the high society party. It drove the price through the roof. I must have the next piece he inspires. I simply must. She drifted away, already bored with me, looking for the next shiny thing. I felt a wave of nausea. They didn't get it. They hadn't heard a word he said. To them, George wasn't a human being with a history and a heart. He was a novelty. He was a flavor of the week. They had consumed his dignity and paid for it with a check, thinking the transaction was fair. I made my way to the office in the back. I needed to be alone. I needed to escape the sound of their laughter. Julian was sitting on the edge of my desk, nursing a glass of scotch he had poured from my private stash. He looked disheveled. His scarf was undone, hanging loosely around his neck like a noose he had managed to slip out of. "Well," Julian said, looking up at me with bloodshot eyes, "you won." "I don't feel like I won," I said, closing the door behind me to muffle the roar of the party. "Don't be sentimental, Elena," he sneered, though the bite was gone from his voice. "You just cleared $500,000 on a photograph that was gathering dust in a basement yesterday. You're solvent. You're the talk of the town. You should be thanking me for antagonizing him. Conflict sells." I looked at Julian, really looked at him. For years I had seen him as a giant. I had seen him as the arbiter of my worth. If Julian said a painting was good, it was good. If Julian said I was worthy, I was worthy. Now I saw a small, frightened man. I saw a man who used big words to hide the fact that he felt nothing. He was hollow, and looking at him was like looking in a mirror. "Get off my desk, Julian," I said. He blinked, surprised. "Excuse me?" "Get off my desk and put down the scotch and get out." "Elena, don't be dramatic," he scoffed, trying to regain his composure. "We have to discuss the press release. We need to spin this. The mystery cowboy. We can track him down, maybe get him to sign prints. He's not a product, Julian." I slammed my hand on the desk, the sound startling us both. "He's a man who knows who he is," which is more than I can say for either of us. Julian stood up slowly. He adjusted his jacket, trying to summon his dignity. "You're emotional, it's the stress. You'll realize tomorrow that I'm right. Without my critique, that photo was just wallpaper. I gave it value." "No," I said, my voice shaking. "You gave it a price. He gave it value. There is a difference, and I'm done confusing the two." Julian stared at me for a long moment, his lip curled in disdain. Then he laughed, a cold, bitter sound. "Good luck, Eleanor. See how long you survive in this town without the game. You're nothing without the game." He walked out. I watched the door close. I was alone. I sat down in my leather chair. It cost $3,000. It was uncomfortable. I looked at the spreadsheet on my computer screen. The numbers were all black now. The debt was gone. I was free. But I felt trapped. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the only thing George had left behind. A small, crumpled piece of paper he had used to write down the address for the delivery of the photograph to the buyer. I smoothed it out. His handwriting was neat, precise. I sat there for hours. The party died down. The cleaning crew came and went. The lights in the gallery went out, leaving only the security beams. So I was confused. That was the only word for it. I was confused because everything I had worked for, the money, the status, the recognition, was suddenly sitting in my lap, and it felt like ash. I had spent my life climbing a ladder, only to realize it was leaning against the wrong wall. George had said, "Sometimes the frame costs more than the painting, but it doesn't mean it's worth more." I looked around my office. It was all frames, no painting. I stood up. I walked out into the dark gallery. I looked at the white walls. They looked like hospital walls, sterile, cold. I walked to the front door and locked it. Then I went to the storage room. I grabbed a can of paint, a warm, earthy terracotta color I had bought by mistake months ago and never returned. I opened it. I didn't bother with a drop cloth. I dipped a brush in and slapped it against the pristine white wall. The color looked like the desert. It looked like the dirt on George's boots. I started to cry. I cried for the years I had wasted trying to be someone else. I cried for the girl I used to be, the one who liked to walk barefoot in the grass before I convinced myself that heels were a sign of power. I cried until I was empty, and then I kept painting until the sun came up. The next morning I put a sign in the window, closed for renovation. I didn't open for 2 months. In that time I did what George suggested. I stepped outside. I got in my car, a sensible sedan that I traded my luxury lease in for, and I drove. I didn't go to Paris or New York. I drove east. I crossed the state line into Texas. I didn't have a plan. I just wanted to see the light he talked about. I drove through towns that didn't have galleries, just gas stations and diners. I saw fences that needed mending. I saw windmills turning slowly in the breeze. I rolled my windows down and let the heat fill the car. I stopped at a roadside stand and bought peaches from a woman with hands like tree bark and a smile like the sun. We talked for an hour about nothing and everything. She didn't know who I was, and she didn't care. It was the most honest conversation I had had in 10 years. I realized that the confusion I had felt that night at the gallery wasn't confusion at all. It was the painful, disorienting sensation of waking up. I never found George. I didn't try to track him down. I didn't want to intrude on his peace. I realized later, after doing some research, exactly who he was. I saw the records, the stadiums, the fame. But that didn't matter to me. The man who came to my gallery wasn't the superstar. He was the neighbor. He was the man who stopped to look at a picture of a horse because he remembered the boy who held the reins. He had given me a gift far greater than the auction money. He had given me permission to be real. When I finally returned to Santa Fe, I changed everything. 2 years later, the bell above the door chimed, a real brass bell, not an electronic buzzer. "Come on in, the coffee is fresh," I called out from the back of the shop. I walked out wiping my hands on a denim apron. I wasn't wearing a blazer. I was wearing jeans and a comfortable cotton shirt. My hair was tied back in a loose ponytail. I wasn't wearing makeup, just a bit of moisturizer. The space was unrecognizable. The polished concrete was covered in warm woven rugs. The blinding white walls were gone, replaced by warm earth tones and natural wood shelving. The air conditioning wasn't set to morgue anymore. The front windows were thrown wide open, letting in the sounds of the street and the smell of the roasting chilies from the vendor on the corner. It wasn't called Lumina anymore. I had renamed it The Porch. It wasn't just a gallery. It was a space. We sold art, yes, but not the kind Julian would approve of. We sold pottery made by a local grandmother who had been doing it for 50 years. We sold photographs taken by students at the community college. We sold paintings of landscapes that looked like they were painted with love, not theory. There were chairs, comfortable ones, scattered everywhere. People didn't just come here to buy. They came to sit. They came to talk. A young couple walked in, looking hesitant. They were dressed simply, holding hands. "Hi," the young man said, looking at a price tag on a wooden carving. "We probably can't afford anything here. We just wanted to look." I smiled. It was a real smile. It reached my eyes. "Looking is free," I said, "and the coffee is on the house. Tell me, what do you see in that carving?" "It reminds me of my grandfather's walking stick," the girl said shyly. "It looks sturdy." "That's the best compliment you could give it," I said. As they wandered through the shop, I went back to the counter. Behind it, hanging on the wall in a simple wooden frame, was a photograph. It wasn't The Silence of the Plains. That had been sold to the billionaire, locked away in a vault somewhere. This was a different photo. It was a picture I had taken myself on that trip to Texas. It was just a shot of a dirt road stretching out toward the horizon, with a storm breaking in the distance and a single ray of sunlight hitting a fence post. It wasn't technically perfect. The focus was a little soft. The lighting was uneven. Julian would have torn it apart. But to me, it was a masterpiece. I looked at it every day to remind myself. It reminded me that the storm always breaks. It reminded me that the road goes on forever. And it reminded me of the man in the dusty boots who had walked into my fake world and, without raising his voice, had torn it down so I could build something real. I picked up a mug of coffee and walked to the open window. The sun was setting over Santa Fe, painting the sky in shades of purple and gold that no artist could ever truly capture. I thought about George. I wondered if he was out there somewhere, leaning on a fence, watching this same sun go down. I wondered if he knew that he had saved a life that night. He didn't pull me out of a burning building or push me out of the way of a speeding car. He did something harder. He pulled me out of the quicksand of my own vanity. He taught me that you don't need to be important to be valuable. He taught me that silence speaks louder than noise. He taught me that the most expensive things in life are the ones you can't buy. A breeze blew in, carrying the scent of sage and rain. "Elena," I turned. It was the young couple. They were holding the wooden carving. "We'd like to buy this," the boy said. "It's not much, but it feels right." "It is right," I said. I wrapped the carving in brown paper. I didn't use a gold sticker. I tied it with a piece of twine. "Thank you," the girl said. "You have a beautiful place here. It feels like home." "That's because it is," I said. They left, the bell chiming cheerfully behind them. I stood there in the quiet of the shop, surrounded by things that had stories, things that had hands and hearts behind them. I wasn't confused anymore. I took a sip of coffee, looked at the photo of the Texas road one last time and whispered into the empty room, a message carried on the wind to a ranch somewhere far away. "Thank you, cowboy. I'm finally awake." I turned off the main lights, leaving a single lamp burning in the window, a beacon for anyone else who might be lost in the dark, looking for a place to rest their boots. The night was quiet. The world was vast, and for the first time in my life, I was exactly where I was supposed to be.